For generations of aspiring doctors, and honestly the legendary institutions they hope to attend, there was this one ultimate obsession, a single definitive number handed down every single year by a magazine. The entire medical field basically bowed to this ordinal hierarchy. But today, if you go looking for the absolute #1 medical school in America, you won't find it. That spot has completely vanished. We are looking at a story of a massive institutional rebellion. It's kind of an epic David and Goliath tale, except in this case, the Davids were the most elite, well-funded universities in the world, and they finally just decided to topple the Goliath of the ranking industry.
The 2026 U.S. News Medical School rankings have arrived, and as this quote so perfectly captures, the entire ecosystem of institutional prestige is in absolute chaos. Students are facing a system in major transition, where the ultimate elite names, institutions like Harvard and Stanford, are just completely missing. The definitive scoreboard that shaped the careers of a whole generation of doctors has been entirely dismantled.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a literal revolution, the dramatic overhaul of the U.S. News Medical School rankings. We're going to trace exactly how the most powerful medical schools staged a massive walkout, how the ranking system scrambled to survive by completely changing its methodology, and how we actually evaluate the best medical schools in the world today.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The end of number 1. 2. The great ranking boycott. 3. Enter the tier system. 4. Decoding the 2026 results. 5. The missing elite schools. And lastly, number 6. What actually matters now. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The end of number 1 and the fatal flaw of ordinal rankings.
So, for decades, everyone just poured over this clean, ordinal scoreboard, right? Harvard was number 1, Johns Hopkins number 2, and so on. But that old system suffered from a massive structural problem, false precision. Think about it. Is there really a meaningful, real-world difference in the educational quality between the number 4 and number 5 medical school in America? Almost certainly not. But the old system presented that tiny, completely insignificant gap as a rigid, factual hierarchy, and that created intense, compounding pressure. To climb from, say, number 12 to number 11, schools began aggressively gaming their metrics. They would artificially narrow their admissions criteria, prioritizing standardized test takers with perfect MCAT scores over candidates who displayed actual clinical empathy or a real desire to serve their local communities. Basically, they were optimizing for a magazine's algorithm rather than optimizing for producing the best possible doctors.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Great Ranking Boycott, or the Rebellion of the Elites.
Now, this shift away from those ordinal rankings didn't happen because U.S. News suddenly had a change of heart. Oh no, it was forced by a massive rebellion at the very top. Let's walk through this timeline, because this is really the climax of the story. The catalyst hit in 2022, when heavyweights like Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and Penn simply walked away. They publicly refused to submit their proprietary data. By the time the 2025 edition rolled around, the scale of this walkout was staggering. Roughly 20% of the schools that had previously ranked in the top 100 were just gone. They effectively walked out of the room, leaving the ranking monopoly bleeding and forcing an industry-wide reckoning.
The reasoning behind the boycott was devastatingly clear. As the dean of Harvard Medical School publicly pointed out, the old methodology created perverse incentives and unintended consequences. I mean, think about it. If a school's fundamental mission is to train doctors for rural, underserved communities, but the ranking actively penalizes them for taking holistic applicants over perfect GPA robots, is that ranking actually measuring a good medical school? The elites argued, and rightfully so, that the old system explicitly rewarded raw exclusivity and wealth over the actual life-saving mission of medicine.
Which brings us to Section 3. Enter the tier system, a 4-band solution.
Look, you simply cannot credibly declare a #1 medical school in America if Harvard, Stanford, and Penn refuse to play ball. Facing an absolute existential crisis, U.S. News was forced to pivot. They went from a hyper-specific ladder to broad performance bands. We went from fighting tooth and nail over the number 3 spot to simply existing within a broader tier. And notice the biggest casualty in this new system. The subjective reputational surveys are completely gone. U.S. News finally stopped asking residency program directors to weigh in on a school's prestige, fully acknowledging that, honestly, those directors don't actually use magazine rankings to select their medical residents anyway.
So how does it actually work now? Let's quickly walk through the new mechanics. Step 1. They gather raw institutional data, like research funding. Step 2, they calculate the percentile performance compared to all the other rated schools. And Step 3, they group them into 4 broad tiers. Tier 1 is this massive bucket representing the 85th to 99th percentile. And here's the real psychological shock to those hyper-competitive pre-med students. Within each tier, schools are simply listed alphabetically. There's no internal ranking anymore. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a total paradigm shift. A Tier 1 school is just a Tier 1 school, whether your name starts with an A or a Z.
All right, Section 4, Decoding the 2026 Results. Let's follow the money and the mission. Because schools obviously have different goals, U.S. News split their evaluation into two entirely different tracks. When evaluating the research track, the new methodology is essentially a proxy for money. NIH funding and research activity now make up a massive 60% of the pie. Why does NIH funding hold so much weight? Because it's literally the lifeblood that funds massive academic medical centers, sprawling bench science labs, and those global breakthroughs we hear about. By tying the tiers so heavily to grant dollars, we're seeing massive state institutions like the University of Florida and the University of California newly achieving Tier 1 status, largely driven by significant increases in their raw research funding.
But flip over to the primary care track, and wow, the entire landscape completely changes. The primary care methodology heavily evaluates the percentage of graduates who actually enter primary care specialties and go on to train and serve in frontline clinics. So a bench science powerhouse like Yale shines brilliantly in research, but mission-driven schools focused on rural or community medicine, like East Carolina University or UC Davis, absolutely dominate the primary care tier. It just proves that the best medical school depends entirely on what kind of doctor a community actually needs.
Section 5. The Missing Elite Schools, also known as the meta-tier.
Okay, we have to address the elephant in the room here. The actual top-funded, globally recognized institutions are still noticeably missing from these Tier 1 lists. Because they flat-out refuse to submit data, U.S. News formally labels these juggernauts as unranked. And there's a wonderful, tasteful irony here, isn't there? The idea that the absolute best schools in the world are labeled unranked by a magazine is absurd, and everyone in academia knows it. In the real world of medicine, these institutions effectively exist in a meta-tier, or let's call it Tier 0. They completely dominate global citations, clinical breakthroughs, and medical history.
Let the raw numbers do the talking here. Just look at the staggering scale of real-world NIH funding. Across its institution, Johns Hopkins pulls in over $866 million. UCSF brings in $824 million. To put that into perspective, a school wielding nearly $1 billion in federal research backing absolutely does not need to fill out an arbitrary magazine survey to prove to the world that it's a titan of medicine. The real top tier of medical education exists entirely independently of a publisher's label.
Finally, Section 6. What actually matters now? Rankings versus reality.
The tiered system is certainly more honest than the false precision it replaced for sure, but it still fails to answer the incredibly practical questions about what a student's medical training will actually look like on a day-to-day basis. Ask literally any practicing physician, and they will tell you that a Tier 1 label does not matter when you are trying to match into a highly competitive surgical residency. Residency match rates are the lifeblood of a student's future. The quality of your clinical training sites, your learning style, and, let's be real, the crushing reality of graduating with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt are what truly define your early career. A high magazine ranking is not going to pay off a $500,000 student loan.
So, the era of the magazine monopoly? It's officially over. The evolution of this system proves that a Tier 1 label simply means a school has strong research funding and selectivity, not that it guarantees the perfect fit for you. And an unranked label? That just means the school decided to keep its data to itself. Power has effectively returned to the students, who now have to look beyond the broad tiers to find their perfect institutional alignment.
Ultimately, the big question is no longer what tier is this school. The real question is, what kind of doctor do you want to be? And what metrics actually matter when training the people who will one day save our lives? Keep questioning the metrics, look behind the prestige, and thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.